Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
There was a group of friends who decided to take a weekend trip to an old, isolated cabin deep in the woods. The place had a reputation for being haunted, but they dismissed the stories as local folklore, nothing more than ghost stories to spook tourists. They arrived late at night, the moon barely casting enough light to see the narrow, winding road leading up to the cabin. It was the perfect setup for a weekend getaway. The cabin itself was old, weathered by time and neglect, with creaky floors and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The friends joked around, setting up their gear, and as they started a fire in the hearth, the atmosphere felt almost cozy despite the eerie surroundings. They spent the night drinking and telling ghost stories, but something felt off. It wasn't the stories themselves. It was the way the wind howled through the trees, almost like it was trying to whisper something to them. Around midnight, one of them, Emma, suggested they play a game of truth or dare. At first, everyone was hesitant, but they decided to go ahead. Emma dared one of the guys, Jake, to venture out into the woods alone for 10 minutes. Jake, confident and a bit cocky, accepted without hesitation. He grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the woods, his laughter echoing in the distance. The group watched, waiting for him to return. But after 10 minutes passed, then 20, they started to get worried. They called out his name, but the woods swallowed their voices. The flashlight beam flickered in and out of sight before it disappeared altogether. Panic began to set in. The group split up to search, calling for him and shining flashlights into the trees, but there was no sign of Jake. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Then they heard it, an odd sound coming from the woods. It was a low, guttural growl, like an animal in pain. They froze. No animal on earth could make a sound like that. The growl turned into a harsh, rasping noise, followed by what could only be described as a faint, whispering voice. The voice wasn't saying words, just a series of garbled sounds that made their skin crawl. The group was frozen, paralyzed by fear. It wasn't until the flashlight suddenly turned on again, shining from deep in the woods, that they rushed in that direction. They found Jake, hunched over a tree, shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his clothes torn, and his face pale as death. But what terrified them the most was that his mouth was covered in dirt, as if he had been eating it. He couldn't speak at first, only muttering incoherently. After what felt like an eternity, Jake finally managed to explain. He had wandered deeper into the woods than he intended, and suddenly everything had changed. The trees seemed to shift, the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, and then he saw something, a figure. At first it was just a shadow, then it became clearer. A woman in a long, tattered white dress, her eyes black voids that seemed to absorb light. She stared at him for what felt like hours. Her lips never moved, but Jake heard her voice in his mind, telling him that he wasn't supposed to be there, that no one should ever enter the woods at night. Before he could react, he felt something grab his ankle, pulling him towards the forest floor. He struggled, but it was as if the earth itself was trying to swallow him whole. He couldn't explain it, but he could hear the whispers now, louder than ever before. They were all around him, urging him to stay, to let the darkness take him. They rushed him back to the cabin, but something had changed. Jake's eyes never left the windows, his body twitching nervously. The rest of the group huddled together, trying to make sense of what happened. As the hours dragged on, they could feel it. Something was watching them, something that wasn't human. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sent them into a state of heightened paranoia. The next morning, they decided to leave, but as they packed their bags, they noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was wide open. No one had opened it. No one had been outside. But the door stood ajar, as if inviting them back in. They rushed out of there, never looking back. As they drove away, the trees seemed to loom taller and darker, and they could swear they saw shadows moving just beyond the tree line. But they didn't stop to check. They drove, and they never spoke of it again. To this day, no one has returned to that cabin. No one ever dared to find out who or what was waiting for them in the woods that night. But some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers on the wind. They say the forest remembers, and it doesn't forget the ones who dared to trespass.
Story number 2.
It was a late spring night when Sarah and her friends decided to take a weekend trip to a small coastal town known for its quaint charm and beautiful boardwalk. The town, though peaceful during the day, had a reputation for being unsettling after dark. Most locals avoided the boardwalk once the sun went down, but Sarah and her group brushed off the warnings as local superstition. They arrived around sunset, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. The boardwalk stretched out along the beach, lit by the flickering lights of old-fashioned lamps. There were a few shops still open, but as night fell, the boardwalk began to empty. Sarah and her friends decided to take a stroll down to the end, where the pier jutted out into the ocean. The air was thick with salt and the sound of the waves crashing beneath them. As they walked, the mood shifted. The wind picked up and the air turned colder. The only sounds now were their footsteps and the distant crash of waves. They reached the end of the boardwalk, where a small, abandoned amusement park stood. The Ferris wheel loomed like a forgotten giant, its lights dead, its metal structure rusted and creaking in the wind. "Let's go check it out," one of Sarah's friends, Mia, suggested. Everyone was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of them. The gate to the park was unlocked, and they ventured inside, laughing nervously as they stepped over broken glass and debris. The silence was unsettling, and as they explored, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. They came across an old carnival mirror maze, its glass warped and cracked. Someone dared Sarah to go in alone, and despite her unease, she agreed. She stepped into the maze, the lights flickering overhead. She asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "The one from the maze. He doesn't let people leave once they've seen him. You're lucky you got away." They asked her who he was, but the woman only shook her head. "No one knows. He's been here longer than anyone can remember. People come and they leave, but he stays. He always stays." Sarah and her friends left the town early the next morning, but the image of the creature haunted them long after. They never spoke of it again. But some nights, when the wind howls just right, Sarah can still hear the echo of those long, hollow footsteps following her from somewhere just beyond the edge of the dark.
Story number 3.
It was a warm summer evening when a group of college students decided to spend the weekend camping in a secluded national park. The area was known for its picturesque views and quiet atmosphere, making it a popular spot for hikers and adventurers. They arrived at the campground late in the afternoon, a few hours before sunset. The place was nearly empty, the only sounds being the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. They set up their tents and campfire, laughing and joking around as they prepared for the night ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the campground grew quieter, the darkness creeping in. The students huddled around the fire, sharing stories of past camping trips and spooky tales they had heard from friends. One of them, Mark, had a penchant for telling ghost stories, and as the fire crackled, he began recounting the tale of a missing hiker who had vanished in the very same park years ago. According to local legend, the hiker had been lost for days before he was found, his body covered in strange, deep scratches, and his eyes wide open in terror, as though he had seen something unimaginable. No one had ever been able to explain what had happened, but it was said that the hiker's last words were, "It's still out there." The story sent a chill down everyone's spine, and the group fell into an uneasy silence, the only sound now being the crackling of the fire. It was then that one of the girls, Lucy, heard something, a faint, scratching sound, like fingernails against the bark of a tree. She turned to the others, her eyes wide with fear, but they brushed it off as an animal, probably a raccoon or a squirrel. But the scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. The wind had died down, and the only noise in the woods was that eerie, scraping sound. Mark stood up, looking toward the trees at the edge of the campground. "It's probably just an owl or something," he said, trying to sound nonchalant, but his voice wavered slightly. Suddenly, the sound stopped. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air for a few moments before they heard a distant, guttural growl, a noise that didn't belong to any animal they knew. The group froze, their eyes wide with panic. The growl was followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush, breaking branches as it came closer. At that moment, they knew something was wrong. Mark grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows and trees. "We need to pack up and leave," he said, his voice shaking. But it was too late. From the woods, a figure emerged, a tall, emaciated creature with pale, almost translucent skin. Its arms were unnaturally long, and its eyes were black voids that seemed to absorb all light. It moved toward them slowly, dragging one of its legs, as if injured. Its face was contorted in a grotesque, toothy grin, and its mouth opened wide, emitting a horrible screeching sound that made their blood run cold. Panic set in as the students scrambled to their feet, rushing to gather their things and flee the campsite. But the creature didn't move like anything human. It slithered, its body bending and twisting in unnatural ways, faster than they could run. They could hear its breathing, raspy and labored behind them, growing louder with every step they took. In their frantic dash through the woods, they got separated. Mark, who was leading the way, heard a scream behind him, but when he turned, there was no sign of his friends, just the darkness and the sound of branches snapping underfoot. He kept running, his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Hours later, he stumbled into a nearby ranger station, out of breath and covered in scratches. The rangers quickly called for help, and a search party was formed to look for the others. But when they returned to the campsite, it was empty. No sign of the tents, the fire, or any of the students. All that remained were deep gouges in the ground, as if something large and heavy had been dragged across the earth. The search party found the bodies the next day, scattered across the woods in places that made no sense. Some were torn apart, their faces twisted in fear, while others had been buried beneath layers of dirt and debris, as if something had tried to hide them. But the most chilling discovery was that none of the bodies had any eyes, just hollow, empty sockets where they had once been. The official story was that the students had gotten lost and attacked by animals, but the rangers who had found them knew better. They never spoke of it to outsiders, but every year, on the anniversary of the disappearances, they would hear the same faint scraping sound in the woods. No one dared to venture too far into the forest after dark, and the legend of the missing hikers grew with each passing year. To this day, the park remains a place of fear for those who know the truth, and some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the scratching sounds in the woods, echoing from the darkness, a reminder of the things that still lurk there.
Story number 4.
A group of friends decided to spend the weekend in a remote cabin located deep in the mountains, far from civilization. It was the perfect place to escape the chaos of everyday life. They arrived late at night, the winding road leading them through dense, dark woods. The cabin was old, and the closer they got, the more isolated and eerie it seemed. There were no other houses nearby, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the wind. As they settled in, they couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, but they shrugged it off, making jokes and getting the fire going in the fireplace. After hours of talking and drinking, they decided to retire to their rooms for the night. Just as they were about to sleep, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness. One of the friends, Rachel, joked nervously, "Maybe the power's just old, nothing to worry about." But the rest of them couldn't shake the feeling that something had caused it. They gathered in the living room and lit some candles. The wind howled louder outside, and then in the distance, they heard something. At first, it was barely audible, a faint tapping, like the sound of someone knocking on the window. One of them, Mike, went to investigate, but when he looked outside, there was nothing. No one could explain it, but the knocking continued intermittently throughout the night, growing louder and more erratic. It wasn't the wind or the trees. It was as though someone or something was trying to get their attention. Rachel suggested they check the woods. Maybe someone was out there, but none of the others were willing to go outside in the dark, fearing what they couldn't see. They decided to wait it out until morning, thinking they were just being paranoid. But then came a loud thud from the roof. It was followed by a scrape, as though something heavy was being dragged across it. The fear began to settle in. They heard it again, the dragging sound, followed by another thud. This time, they could no longer ignore it. They grabbed their flashlights and ran outside, but the cabin was eerily quiet. There was nothing on the roof, nothing in the trees. But as they turned back to head inside, they noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it stood completely still. The figure was dressed in rags, its face obscured by shadow. The flashlights flickered and died, and the figure was gone. The group rushed back inside, locking the doors and windows. They were shaken, but at least they were together. But as they sat there trying to calm down, they heard it again. The knocking. This time, it was not on the windows, but the door. A slow, methodical knock, as if someone were waiting for them to answer. No one moved. They couldn't bring themselves to open the door. The knocking stopped, but they could hear something else now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The figure from the woods, they realized with horror, had somehow made its way around to the back. They were trapped. One of the friends, Jake, made a run for it. He opened the back door and bolted into the woods, hoping to outrun whatever was out there. The rest of the group screamed at him to come back, but he didn't stop. They heard the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance before there was a sudden, horrifying silence. After what felt like hours, Jake came back, or rather something that looked like Jake. He stumbled toward the cabin, covered in dirt and leaves, his clothes torn. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, and his mouth was open, gasping for air, but he couldn't speak. He couldn't form any words. The others rushed to him, but as they reached out, they saw it, the marks on his neck, deep scratches, as though something had clawed at him. His hands were shaking violently. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "It's still out there. It's not him." Jake collapsed into the arms of his friends, his body trembling uncontrollably. They tried to help him, but he couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop mumbling the same words over and over. "It's not him." They spent the rest of the night huddled together in fear, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, they gathered their things and left the cabin, never looking back. But Jake wasn't the same. He never spoke of what happened out there, but the look in his eyes said everything. There was something in those woods, something that followed them, something that had waited for them to make a mistake. No one ever saw Jake again after that night. The cabin was eventually abandoned, and the area became known for its strange disappearances. The locals still whisper about the tall figure in the woods, the one that waits for anyone foolish enough to venture too far into the dark. But no one dares to speak too openly about it, for fear that it might hear them. And to this day, hikers and adventurers who wander too deep into the woods report hearing faint footsteps behind them, or the unmistakable sound of someone knocking on the trees. But when they turn around, there's never anyone there, only the wind and the echo of something waiting in the dark.
Story number 5.
There's an old legend about a small, secluded town that lies at the edge of a dense forest. It's a town so forgotten that even the most diligent of maps can't seem to find it. The residents are few, and the stories they tell are stranger than anything anyone could imagine. It's said that on rare occasions, someone will unknowingly wander into the town thinking it's just another place to pass through, but they always leave, shaken and disturbed, never speaking of what they saw. One summer evening, a couple, Eli and Sarah, decided to take a road trip through the countryside. They were looking for something off the beaten path, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the road, they passed a sign that read, "Welcome to Kinley Town." Neither of them had ever heard of it before, but they thought it would be a quaint place to stop for the night. As they entered, the first thing they noticed was how quiet it was. The streets were eerily empty, save for a few weathered houses. There wasn't a single soul to be seen, not even a stray dog. The air felt stale, like it hadn't moved in years. But what struck them most was the feeling of being watched. There was a sense that something unseen was waiting, lingering just out of sight. They stopped at the first gas station they could find. The old man behind the counter greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He gave them directions to the only inn in town, a small two-story building just a few blocks down. "You'll find a good night's rest there," the man said, his voice strangely hollow. When they reached the inn, the door creaked as they pushed it open. The air inside was cold, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. The receptionist, an elderly woman with pale, wrinkled skin, greeted them with an unsettling calmness. "We have room for you," she said without asking any questions. Her voice, though soft, had an edge to it, something that made Eli uneasy. They were shown to a room at the far end of the hall, and the moment the door shut behind them, the atmosphere shifted. It felt as if the entire building had sighed, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. They tried to shake off the unease and decided to explore the town a little more before bed. As they walked through the streets, they noticed something odd. Every window of every house was boarded up, but they could see faint shadows moving behind them. As they passed an old church on the outskirts, they heard the faint sound of chanting coming from within, though there was no one around. The sound seemed to call to them, but Eli grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away. He didn't want to know what was inside. When they returned to the inn, they found the hall darker than before. The only light was coming from under their door, a pale yellow glow that seemed out of place. They hesitated before entering, but Sarah pushed the door open. The room was exactly the same as when they left, but there was something different about it now. The air was thick, and it felt as if something was pressing down on them. Eli went to turn on the light, but before he could, a loud, low thud echoed through the building. The walls seemed to tremble with it, and the sound came from somewhere deep within the inn. It was followed by a whisper, too soft to understand, but it sent a chill crawling up their spines. Sarah's eyes darted to the window, but there was nothing to see outside, just a blanket of darkness. They bolted for the door, but before they could even reach the handle, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. Panic set in. They fumbled for their phones to use the flashlight, but there was no signal. The silence was unbearable, except for the sound of their own breathing. Then they heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above them. It was getting closer, and the air seemed to grow colder with every step. The floorboards creaked under the weight, and the dragging sound stopped right outside their door. A soft, high-pitched voice whispered through the cracks in the door, "Come play with me." Eli's heart raced, and he grabbed Sarah's hand. Without thinking, they rushed for the window. But when they pulled the curtains back, the sight that met them froze them in place. There, in the darkness, stood a tall figure with hollow eyes, standing perfectly still as if waiting for them. It was the same figure they had seen at the gas station, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. The figure raised one arm slowly, and just before Eli could turn away, the whisper came again, louder now. "You're too late." Suddenly, the door to their room flew open with a deafening crash. In the doorway stood the elderly receptionist, her face twisted in an unnatural grin. Behind her, the hallway was filled with more figures, shadowy, distorted shapes moving toward them. Sarah screamed, and without thinking, Eli pushed her through the window. He followed quickly, but as he landed on the ground below, he turned around just in time to see the figures leaping toward them from the window above. They ran through the streets, their hearts pounding in their chests, but the town seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if it didn't want them to leave, as if it was pulling them back. Just as they reached the edge of town, they turned to look over their shoulders, but the town was gone. All that remained was a dark expanse of trees, as though the town had never existed. They never spoke of Kinley Town again. Neither Eli nor Sarah could ever fully explain what happened that night. But to this day, they both still hear the soft whispering, like the wind calling to them, always asking the same question, "When will you come back?"
Story number 6.
A group of friends decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin located deep in the woods. They were looking for a place to relax, disconnect from the world, and enjoy some quiet time together. The cabin, nestled between towering pine trees, seemed like the perfect getaway. They arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the land as they unpacked their things. The atmosphere was peaceful, too peaceful, but they shrugged it off. They were excited to be out in nature, far away from the noise of the city. As night fell, they gathered around a campfire just outside the cabin, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. There was a strange tension in the air, an unspoken unease that seemed to settle in as the fire crackled and popped. The forest surrounding them was silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the fire and the occasional breeze. The friends joked about how eerie it was, but none of them could shake the feeling that something was watching them from the trees. Around midnight, the conversation turned to ghost stories. One of the friends, Mark, recalled a tale about a local legend, a creature that roamed the woods, hunting anyone who wandered too deep into the forest. The creature was said to have glowing eyes, sharp claws, and a terrifying howl that could freeze anyone who heard it in place. Of course, everyone laughed it off, but as the night grew darker, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Suddenly, there was a noise from the woods. At first, it was so faint they thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. A twig snapping followed by a heavy, dragging sound. Mark stood up and glanced nervously at the trees, trying to reassure everyone that it was probably just an animal. But the others were no longer laughing. They could hear it now too. Something was out there. The group decided to head inside and lock the doors, but as they reached the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, and the lights inside flickered erratically, as if something was tampering with the power. They hesitated, but eventually entered, their minds racing with thoughts of what might be out there in the dark. The night dragged on in an uneasy silence. The group tried to sleep, but none of them could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled outside, and the house creaked under the pressure of the storm that had rolled in. Then, in the middle of the night, they heard it. A loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping across the floor above them. Mark, who was closest to the stairs, cautiously made his way up to check it out. The others followed, too scared to be left alone. As they reached the second floor, the noise stopped. They stood there, listening, waiting for something to happen. But all they heard was the sound of their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts in their chests. That's when they saw it, a shadow moving quickly across the hallway. It was too fast to be human. Mark called out, but there was no response. Panic set in as they realized that whatever it wasn't human. The door at the end of the hallway slammed open, revealing nothing but darkness. Mark reached for the light switch, but it flickered and went out. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed from downstairs. The friends ran back to the staircase, but when they reached the bottom, the living room was empty. The door was wide open, and the front steps were covered in strange, muddy footprints. They could hear the distant howl of the creature Mark had spoken about earlier, and they knew without a doubt that they were not alone. The group gathered what little they had left and rushed out into the woods, hoping to find their way back to civilization. But as they ran, the footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. They could hear it breathing, sniffing the air, and the sound of its claws scraping against the ground. When they thought they had outrun it, they looked back, only to see a pair of glowing eyes watching them from the trees. The friends never made it back to the cabin. They were found days later, wandering the woods in a dazed state, unable to remember what had happened. The only thing they could recall was the feeling of being hunted, of something watching them from the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. The locals who had heard their story would never talk about the creature in the woods again. No one dared to go too deep into those woods after dark, and the cabin was abandoned soon after. It remains a forgotten place, hidden among the trees, where the whispers of the past still linger, and the eyes of the creature are said to still watch, waiting for the next group of travelers to wander too far.
Story number 7.
A group of 4 friends, all in their late 20s, decided to take a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin deep in the woods. They had been planning the trip for months and were excited to disconnect from their busy lives, leaving behind the hustle of the city for some quiet time in nature. The cabin was old, but it had a charm that made it seem like the perfect escape. It sat alone on the edge of a forest, miles away from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. They arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with rich oranges and purples. The dense trees surrounding the cabin gave it an eerie, secluded feel, but they were determined to have fun and not let the quiet surroundings unsettle them. The interior of the cabin was rustic but comfortable, and after unpacking, they lit a fire in the fireplace and settled down for the night. They laughed, talked, and enjoyed the fire, the sound of crickets filling the silence of the woods. Around midnight, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. A cold draft blew through the cracks in the windows, making the atmosphere feel uncomfortable. The group shrugged it off, blaming the old cabin for the sudden chill. But as the night wore on, they started hearing odd sounds. At first, it was just the wind rustling the trees outside, but then it became something more. A faint scratching sound, like something or someone scraping against the cabin walls. It was so subtle at first that they thought it was just the wind playing tricks on them. But it grew louder. One of the friends, Mark, suggested it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew more distinct and deliberate. It sounded like nails dragging across the wood, methodical, like someone or something was trying to get in. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the unease in their minds growing with each passing second. Then, without warning, the door to the cabin creaked open, sending a cold gust of air through the room. Everyone froze. No one had gone near the door. It was ajar, but it hadn't been when they had last checked. The room was suddenly colder, the fire in the hearth flickering and dying out. They quickly closed the door and locked it, but a sense of dread settled over them. They decided to head upstairs to bed, though no one felt like sleeping. The house was unnaturally quiet now. The wind outside ceased, and the sound of the scratching stopped. As they lay in bed, the silence was unbearable. That's when the knocking started. A slow, methodical knock at the front door. It was faint at first, almost like the tapping of a finger against wood. But it grew louder, as if something was trying to get in. The friends looked at each other in confusion and fear. One of them, Sarah, tried to rationalize it, claiming it was just the house settling. But no one was convinced. They heard it again, louder, more insistent. One of the friends, Jake, volunteered to check it out. He grabbed a flashlight and carefully descended the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the door, the knocking stopped. But when he opened the door, nothing was there. He stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the dark woods, but all he saw were the shadows of trees swaying gently in the wind. No one was around. He was about to return to the cabin when he heard a low, guttural growl from the forest. His skin crawled, and he turned quickly, rushing back into the house, slamming the door behind him. The friends were now visibly shaken. They tried to convince themselves it was just the sound of an animal, but deep down, they knew it wasn't. The night dragged on in tense silence. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt amplified. But then at around 3 a.m., something even more terrifying happened. A loud crash echoed from upstairs. It sounded like furniture being knocked over. Mark, the most fearless of the group, bolted up from the couch, flashlight in hand. The others followed as he led the way up the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the still house. They reached the top of the stairs, and as they slowly made their way down the hallway toward the bedroom, the floor creaked underfoot. And then they saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its outline seemed to distort and flicker like it wasn't quite real. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. Mark froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure suddenly jerked forward, moving at an inhuman speed. The group screamed and ran down the hall, but the figure was faster. As they reached the stairs, they heard it. The sound of something or someone running right behind them. The friends sprinted down the staircase and into the living room, where they tried to barricade themselves in. But the door opened, and the figure stood in the doorway, its glowing eyes staring into theirs. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, and in that moment, the friends understood. They weren't just dealing with some creature of the woods. They were dealing with something ancient, something that thrived on fear, something that had been watching them from the moment they arrived. The creature stepped forward, its form flickering and shifting like smoke. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. But before they could react, the room went dark. The last thing they heard was the creature's low growl, then nothing but silence. The next morning, when the sun rose, the cabin was empty. There was no sign of the friends. Their belongings were still scattered around the house, but no trace of them remained. The authorities searched the woods for days, but they found nothing. The locals who lived near the area spoke in hushed tones, warning anyone who ventured into the forest to never go too far off the beaten path. There were stories of other people who had disappeared, and each time the woods seemed to claim them, like it was waiting for the next group of travelers to come too close. To this day, the cabin remains abandoned, its windows boarded up, the door slightly ajar. Every now and then a hiker or wanderer might pass by and hear the faint sound of knocking from deep within the trees, but no one dares to venture in any longer. They say the creature still waits patiently for its next victims, and that the moment you step into the woods, it knows. It's always watching, waiting.